One story thread we've seen so far this section is that when we want to make predictions about nonlinear systems, we don't need to be that precise in our initial conditions or in our modeling parameters, and our prediction is still going to hold pretty close to the true system. In contrast, with nonlinear systems, that's not going to be the case. In order for our prediction to completely hold true or even be close to the real system, we're going to need to know with infinite precision what our initial conditions are, and we need to know with infinite precision what the parameters in our model are. Because many nonlinear systems are very sensitive to their initial conditions. And when we make these predictions, the outcome of a nonlinear system might appear random, like the throwing of the dice or the playing of Plinko in The Price is Right. But these systems are completely deterministic. So what are the implications of these real-world nonlinear systems in things that really do affect our everyday lives and our future? We want to think about how modeling nonlinear systems can help us make predictions about the future and maybe change our behaviors. Like our ancestors before that were interested in predicting when is the best time to go to war, the best time to plant our crops, is it going to be a rainy season or not, they looked towards the heavens and the constellations to make some of these predictions, and then those methods evolved over time. But they needed to know things about the future in order to ensure their survival. And fundamentally, nothing has changed millennia later. We are still in need of predicting the future to ensure our survival. However, the world has gotten more complicated and more chaotic, so modeling these systems has become even tougher than in the past. We see here two systems that we're interested in modeling to maintain our everyday life. We want to be able to model economic systems so that we know how we can make adjustments to the macroeconomy and the microeconomy to ensure that everyone has jobs, everyone's making money, everyone can eat, everyone can enjoy their life. But there are unexpected things that happen even in the best models. We see the 2008 crash here illustrated, which most models that were out there for the economy, the broader stock market, were not predicting. We see on the right here average temperature change over time, indicating that almost entirely across the globe we're seeing higher temperatures now than we did 50, 60 years ago. If we want to avoid future catastrophes, be they economic, climate, health, or otherwise, models may be one way to go to predict what's going to happen if we do or do not make some sort of intervention. As I record this in late April of 2020, we are in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are given stay-at-home orders, asked not to leave the house except for absolute necessities. But where did this guidance come from? In part, it came from models, but also previous experience in pandemics. We're being told that by staying home, by socially distancing, by improving our hygiene, that we are going to be flattening the curve, as we see on the left. If we don't have these preventive measures, the number of cases is going to be increased, the number of deaths, the number of hospitalizations are going to be very high, and exceed what our healthcare system capacity can withstand. But through modeling and through looking at things like the 1918 flu epidemic, we can take interventions that are going to hopefully reduce or spread over time the infections and the deaths and the hospitalizations. And if we see so far in this crisis, different countries who have taken different strategies but also have different initial conditions, different makeups in their society, different age brackets, have fared differently, at least in this case, in terms of deaths since the first 100 deaths were reported. Some countries have taken very aggressive action, locking down the country, enforcing the use of masks, improving hygiene measures, and have had some effects in reducing their infections and their death rate. Some countries have been slower to act or have been less aggressive in those tactics. And what we're seeing now within the United States is a difference of opinion on the tactics we can take, and these can differ state by state. So again, as of this recording, some states are planning to maintain a more aggressive policy of flattening this curve and increasing the social distancing and preparing for the worst. Other states, people have been interested in opening back up, decreasing the social distancing, opening up business, and getting back to work. And there's been protests in the streets about this subject. As the 2 months or so have gone on in this crisis, we've seen different sorts of predictions from early on towards now of how many infections, how many deaths we were going to see. Some protesters and skeptics have seen this difference in estimates as being overblown fear, or scientists just trying to foment fear in society about this epidemic. Many of the models that are predicting how many people are going to get infected, how many people are going to die, are based on the SIR model, the susceptible, infectious, and recovered or removed model. Now, some of these models can be very complex, some of them can be a little bit simpler, but all of these models are really nonlinear systems at their core. And inherently, modeling a nonlinear system, as we've been seeing, is going to be riddled with problems. Even if we are able to model a pandemic or infection absolutely perfectly, because of the nonlinear nature of it, our predictions are still not going to be exact. They're not going to be precise. So right away, one issue we're going to have is that our initial conditions or our current conditions need to have absolute precision in order to be able to make predictions about the future. It's likely that this nonlinear system is going to be sensitive to initial conditions. And the problem we see right away with this epidemic is that we don't know our initial conditions. We don't have testing necessarily to know how many people are infected, how many people may be asymptomatic and still able to spread the virus. Some of the other metrics we're using might not be the most accurate either. How do we count someone who has died from coronavirus versus someone who has died from something else? So unfortunately, we're using this flawed, imprecise, and inaccurate data and feeding it into our model. So of course, what the model predicts is not going to necessarily be the most accurate future prediction. On top of that, some of the parameters in the model, we don't know exactly. We don't know exactly what the infection rate is. We don't know how to necessarily model what people washing their hands or wearing a mask is going to do to that infection rate. It should reduce it, but how do we really say how much it's going to reduce it? And as time goes on and we're updated on how many people have been diagnosed as testing positive, we can update our model and update what those estimates are going to be. So, of course, the estimates are going to change over time. Inputs into the model are going to keep changing, and as we learn more about the disease, some of the parameters in the model are going to change as well. So a revision of these estimates is only going to be natural over time, as presumably, as time goes on, the information we have about these conditions is going to be improved, or at least more realistic as to where we are today. If we look in a slightly different realm, but still a nonlinear system, we can look at weather on the left, or more globally, climate on the right. So again, if you look at a forecast, let's say a 10-day forecast versus a 3-day forecast, well, we can look 10 days out and we can have a decent idea of what the temperature is going to be 10 days from now, the chance of precipitation 10 days from now. But as we get closer and closer to that date that we originally predicted, our estimates are going to improve. The 3-day forecast is going to be more reliable than a 10-day forecast. But if we predict the weather 10 days from now, when we are only 3 days from that date, we now have a 3-day forecast. As we saw with the Lorenz toy example, predictions as we go further and further out are going to have a wider and wider band of possibilities that it's going to have. Again, we don't know exactly what our initial conditions are. We don't have the current temperature readings for every spot on the planet, and some of those temperature readings are not going to be the most precise. And we don't necessarily know with all the precision, all the parameters of these different climate models. Now, there's several different models that are accepted to be predicting what climate change is going to look like as we go out in this graph to 2030 over to 2040. And we see from these different types of models, we have these different estimates happening as to what the future temperature increase is going to be from today. Now, they're presenting these bands of probabilities of what the temperature increase is going to be. Thinking back to the Lorenz models we were looking at, we could produce these types of bands if we had at least an idea of what the error in our current measurements were, what the error on the parameters were. We could do a Monte Carlo simulation, and we could predict out in the future from all of these different differences in inputs what the difference in the output was going to be, and create a probability distribution. So that's what these models are doing, is making this probability distribution as we try to predict out several years. Now, by making these probability distributions of what the future is going to look like, we're really trying to acknowledge the flaws in our model and the flaws in our measurements, and trying to come up with maybe a 95% confidence interval based on the model and our best guess as to what the error in our measurement is, what the future is going to look like. So it's not trying to hide the failings of the models, it's really trying to be very open with it. But again, skeptics are going to look at these probability bands or the updating of the model as a failure of the model or bias in the model itself. And there's no doubt that models do, and it's pretty much unavoidable to contain some sort of bias from whoever made the model. But we really have to acknowledge that predicting the future in these complicated systems is hard. The models can be and are always wrong, and our measurements are inaccurate and they are imprecise. But what do we do with this? Are the models giving us bad predictions? Is it rigged? Is it biased? These are possibilities, but we're trying to do the best we can with the information we have to make predictions so that we can change our behaviors if those predictions are taking us in a direction that we don't like. But if the models are giving us this uncertain future or this range of probabilities, does that mean that we should throw out the model? Is it useless? I would argue no. It's the best we can do to model what our future is going to look like. And as time goes on, we can hope our models are going to get better and more realistic to the situation that's happening, and our measurements can become more precise and more accurate so that the data that we feed into our model can make better predictions for the future. So I want to circle back to where we started this class many months ago when we started talking about modeling systems, to the quote from the very beginning, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." We cannot predict these complicated systems with absolute certainty or even a narrow range of certainty, but if the model is capturing the global behavior of our system, if we can make some predictions about the future and we can use those predictions to make interventions, change our behavior to hopefully avoid negative situations, well, then the model's really done its job. Maybe it's not so important if an economic model is predicting a decline of GDP of 1% versus 1.2%, if a climate model is predicting a temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius versus 2.5 degrees Celsius. It's really the bigger picture that we want to be concentrating on. What are the predictions telling us the trend is going to be in the future if we do nothing? So, in the end, why should we care? Why is it good to know anything about these nonlinear systems? I've been somewhat negative in this section that our models are, no matter what we do, not going to give us an exact prediction of what's going to happen in the future. But again, in general, they're still going to be useful. We want to understand how are the models being made and the inherent difficult nature of making predictions with nonlinear models. So I want to just end this with paraphrasing what my advisor likes to say. When we are pursuing our mechanical engineering degree, we are going to be getting a Bachelor of Science, not a Bachelor of Making Stuff. We really want to be understanding what are the underlying assumptions, processes, solution techniques going into these models, solving these models, and making the predictions, and not simply blindly using the models or trusting the models. When is using one model appropriate and when is it not? That's going to be the science part of your degree.